Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host. And in this podcast, we talk about leadership and communication skills and presentation skills. But today, we're doing something a little bit different. I'm interviewing Sandy Rosenthal, who is the founder of the nonprofit group levees.org, who lived in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and watched her city get flooded because the levees fell apart. The levees are the dams that keep the water out of the city. And the more she saw it, the angrier she got, until she decided to create a group and try to find out the truth. And she indeed discovered that the levees were, that it wasn't a force of nature, it was actually failure by on the part of the Army Corps of Engineers who built the levees, who built them in a sloppy fashion, not to code. And that's the people who were responsible for it. I thought we'll have a little bit of inspiration to get us started. The official bio for Sandy is Sandy Rosenthal founded the nonprofit levees.org in 2005. The group's focus is educating the public on that the flooding of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina was due to federal engineering mistakes and not the wrath of nature. Her book, Words Whispered in Water, is about how, against all the odds, she altered the national narrative about the flooding disaster. In March of 2019, Sandy Rosenthal unveiled the Flooded House Museum at a major site where the levees broke in New Orleans. For those efforts, Sandy has been honored with numerous awards, most recently including Outstanding Social Entrepreneur of the Year from Tulane University and Most Influential Woman from Mount Holyoke College. 62% of the American population lives in counties that are protected by levees, where the levees are supposed to keep the water away from the homes. These are the people that Sandy Rosenthal is an activist for and a voice for. She's also the host of the podcast Beating the Big Guys, which is a useful way to find out if you're angry and you have a cause. You can listen to Sandy to learn how to do this. Stay tuned for the interview with Sandy Rosenthal. Sandy Rosenthal, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm delighted to have you. We will be broadcasting this at the beginning of the year because I wanted to have a story of somebody who's done something really amazing, continues to do amazing things to get us started. No pressure, of course.
I appreciate it.
Yes. So, Sandy, before I ask about the work that you do, I always want to know from my guests, if you could, who would be your dream interview? If you could interview someone who's no longer with us, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
Well, that individual immediately pops into my mind. I didn't have to give it even a moment's thought. and that would be the peace activist Frances Crowe.
Ah.
Ms. Frances Crowe lived to the great age of 100. And throughout her life, she devoted herself to true activism. I mean, truly activism. And she was also anti-nuclear energy, which is a separate one of the things she did. I mean, anyone that lived to 100 years old did a lot of things, but she was mainly a peace activist. And I was fortunate enough to meet her when she was 90.
Wow.
And I asked her a question while she was still with us. And I asked her, Ms. Crowe, who, by the way, she's diminutive, tiny. I had to look down to her and at her to talk to her. And I said, Ms. Crowe, how many times have you been arrested in your work with peace activism? And she said, not enough. I thought, wow. I felt, as an activist myself, I felt unworthy. I felt unworthy standing next to this amazing woman. I happened to be there while she was receiving an award at the age of 90. So that is the woman that the individual that I wish I could interview now that she's no longer with us.
Yeah. Well, we will post a link to the Wikipedia page about her in the show notes, because I remember her as a young person when we were demonstrating against nuclear power back in the 70s, and she was one of the speakers, and then also an important voice against the Vietnam War, which my parents were very involved in. So
believe it or not, she was arrested again after I met her 3 more times at the age of 91, 94, and 98.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, I would absolutely be in the audience for that one. I would love to listen to that. But meanwhile, let's talk about you. You had a very interesting, you have a very interesting story about taking on the big guys and fighting against a big guy in the context of Hurricane Katrina. So, Sandy, could you tell us what happened in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans?
Well, most of the nation, in fact, the world, thought at the time that New Orleans was inundated with storm surge from a hurricane, and that was the beginning and the end of the story.
And the terrible floods with people who were trapped on the roofs of their houses, right?
Yes. The flooding in some parts of New Orleans was as high as 10 feet. Most of New Orleans about 5 to 6 feet. But for many, and you have to realize the water came in with force.
Yes.
It was enough to move houses off foundations in many neighborhoods all over the city. So most of the people who were watching this on television, anyone who was old enough to watch TV in August of 2005 was watching the TV set and watching people on their roofs. And they all believed at the time that it was due to the wrath of nature, Mother Nature.
Okay.
So I was in a very unusual space. When I evacuated prior to the hurricane, I packed for 3 weeks. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. No one I know packed for 3 weeks except my family. It's because my husband's in the insurance industry. So having packed for 3 weeks, I was in a relatively comfortable, safe place that I had the opportunity to listen to the news, listen to the radio, watch television, read everything I could get my hands on. And because of that relatively safe place, calm place I was in, I could pay attention to the stories that were coming out, which didn't make sense to me. It didn't make sense to me that these levee failures were due to Mother Nature. It looked to me like they were due to the levees not being built properly.
And the levees you're talking about are basically the dikes that help control the water around New Orleans.
That's exactly right. We had something called hurricane protection that is in New Orleans, is built by the federal government. And we all trusted our dikes and our flood walls and our levees. We never really even thought about them, no more than we would think about, will a federal bridge hold if we drive over it? You don't think about, will bridges hold? Well, we never imagined these levees would break. No one in their wildest dreams imagined that these levees could break and fail. And not only did they break, they broke in 50 different places.
Oh,
so they were destined to fail. They were just waiting for something to come along. In hindsight, they could have broken in a summer storm, in a summer rain. They could have. We know that now. So I began to ask questions, and I wasn't willing to accept that this was because of Mother Nature. In my mind, this was due to the mistakes by our federal government. Keep in mind, I'm not an engineer. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a politician. I'm a nobody, really. I mean, I don't mind calling myself a nobody at the time when this disaster happened. So I began asking questions. And the more questions I asked, suddenly I got pushback. Pushback. Well, I was just had just enough self-respect to believe that if I was receiving pushback, little me and my little ragtag followers, if we're getting pushback, we must be on the right track. We're either absolutely right or we were on the right track.
Who was pushing back?
Well, the first people to push back was the actual Federal Army Corps of Engineers. One of the members of the PR department disguised her identity and used her personal email account to write to me and threaten me by telling that people were organizing to stop the lies that I was putting out.
So the Army, and for our international listeners, the Army Corps of Engineers is the group that builds, in the federal government, that builds dams, levees, their bridges. They're responsible for big infrastructure things, and it's an enormous organization. It's a huge organization.
It is the largest engineering outfit in the world.
Okay.
So thank you for reminding me that not everybody is familiar with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
Well, yeah, people in the U.S. aren't always familiar with it.
Yes,
so
I appreciate that. So immediately I received pushback. And again, it was confusing to me at the time, but I didn't let it stop me. And I certainly didn't allow the idea that organizations were being created to fight my lies. I certainly didn't let that bother me. I keep in mind, all I had to do was look out the window and see people who had lost everything or even lost loved ones. So emails like that weren't enough to stop me.
And so when you were asking questions publicly, what did you discover that was, you talk about being a David in a world of Goliaths, which is, of course, a biblical reference to the little guy, the little shepherd with a little sling who's fighting against the giant. What were you saying that they said were lies?
What I was saying was that the failure of these levees and our losses were not due to Mother Nature and were not an accident, that they were due to mistakes made by the Army Corps of Engineers when they built their levees, which most of them were completed as recently as 5 years prior to that flood. Yes, most of them.
I didn't realize they were that new.
The most significant breaches, the one that by themselves did the most damage on their own, were the ones in the middle of the city, the 17th Street, and a very famous one in the Lower Ninth Ward.
Yes,
I'm sure many people are familiar with the Lower Ninth Ward neighborhood, a historic neighborhood of Black homeowners. So in my mind, if a brand new bridge fell to the ground, I'm going to restart that. in my mind, if a brand new building, 5 years old, crashed to the ground, I would look to the engineer, the contractor, and the architect for what went wrong. I would not look to the janitor. And and at that time, the people of New Orleans, the officials of New Orleans, were being blamed for not paying attention to the maintenance of the levees, which I knew that was just another. At first, it was being this flooding was being blamed on Mother Nature, and then gradually, within a few months, the blame began to fall upon the shoulders of the people who live here in New Orleans for not properly maintaining the levees.
Not again, the people who actually built them below standard.
They were built below standard. And it took a while for that information to come out. I mean, keep in mind, this was over 350 miles of levees, trillions of gallons of water in the city. It took a month to dewater the city. We did not know right away who was responsible and why. And this is significant. For a year, the Army Corps of Engineers, those who ultimately were found to be responsible, they were tight-lipped, refused to answer any questions from Congress until the levee investigations were completed. Well, it took a year for that to happen. And meanwhile, the attention of the American people and really the attention of the world moved on elsewhere, as people will do when a disaster is not right in front of you.
Yeah. So you started an organization to fight on behalf of the people whose lives were damaged by this flood, right?
That's correct.
By the failure, not the flood, but by the failure of what the engineers did.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes.
And the reason is, people said, well, why did you spend all your time doing this? This was not a catastrophe. Restart that. This was not a disaster. It was a bona fide catastrophe. Yes. Over 1,800 people dead within hours. 350,000 families displaced. Yes. Hundreds of thousands of homes destroyed. This was a catastrophe. And I felt that with all the misinformation and lies swirling around, I felt that I had to do something. Keep in mind, I didn't flood. So I had the luxury I did not have to fight FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association. I did not have to worry about hiring a contractor to fix my house. Yes. I did not have to worry about contacting the insurance company to compensate me for my losses. I was in a relatively safe, warm space that I could devote all my energies to getting the truth out.
So let's talk a little bit. I'm going to ask you more about what happened, but let's talk a little bit about your process of how you learned to raise your voice and claim your voice. And because, as you said, that people said you were a nobody. So, working with speakers is a large part of what we do. Helping get women's voices out into the world is my overall mission. Talk to us a little bit about the process you had to go through.
Sure. That's a two-part answer. The first part will probably surprise you, but when I was born profoundly deaf, and at the age of 40, I took up speech therapy because when you're born with a severe or profound deafness, you don't say your words properly. And I'm saying them the way that I hear them. And I'll give you an example. Chicken, I would say chicken. That's what I hear. Well, over time, I learned to correct these things just from feedback from other family members. But a lot of these sounds needed therapy to fix. So at the age of 40, I took speech therapy. And my jaw ached from the effort of working on my speech therapy, but I did it. I took it. I improved my speech, and I got a lot of confidence out of that. It was enjoyable to finally be able to communicate, to talk to people and have them understand me. And I had just completed this speech therapy right around the time that the levees broke. And so that gave me confidence to lead my organization. But as for finding my voice, I believe it's what all of you listeners need to know is whenever you're speaking, it is critical that you not allow people to change the subject or allow the people you're talking to digress or allow them to get you off topic. You've got to keep them on topic. Okay. And people will naturally do it. It's often people with something to hide, with a painful truth to hide.
Yes.
So if you're trying to beat the big guys in your neighborhood, they're the ones who will try to get you to change the subject or push you off kilter. Don't let them. Don't let them. No, the bad news is there's an infinite number of ways to change a subject, but the good news is recognize it's happening and just don't allow it to happen and be nice about it and say, well, thank you for that point, but shall we get back onto the subject of X, Y, and Z, which is we're trying to talk about now. And you'd be surprised how often that's the tack that's taken. The people with a painful truth to hide just try to change the subject. Just don't let them.
Just don't let them. Thank you. That's a very good piece of advice. So when you started speaking up and saying the Army Corps of Engineers, I mean, those engineers who built these levees, built them badly. Do you know what happened? Because this is little Sandy Rosenthal taking on the federal government. What happened?
This is something that any David dealing with a Goliath is going to have to be prepared for. Rather than discuss the merits of what you're saying, they'll go after you.
Yes.
They will go after you. That it is a tried and true method. All the big guys do it. They all work out of the same playbook, and they will try to mischaracterize who you are. For example, I often was told, well, she's not an engineer. Why does she think she knows what she's talking about? But it's not necessary to be an engineer. I can see, I can hear, I can read. And that's really all I need to do. So that's what happened when I opened up my mouth. And I just interpreted that as I must be on the right track if they keep trying to go after me rather than discuss the merits of what I'm saying.
Good for you. Good for you. So talk a little bit, please. So you became a spokesperson. Did you actually sue the government?
That's a great question. I have threatened lawsuit many times, but to get information. Remember, I mentioned earlier that the big guys will try to change the subject, but another one of their attacks is delay. They'll delay answering questions. They'll delay giving you data that you've requested. And so I employed the threat of lawsuit in order to get data that I needed from the federal government in order to pursue my mission, which is education. I believe that every single person who'd lost so much as a teacup demanded to know the real reason that these levees broke. And again, many people lost family members, but even if you've lost a teacup, you deserve to know the truth. And I pushed very, very hard for it. So lawsuit, again, I never actually had to file lawsuit. All I had to do was threaten lawsuit, and you'd be surprised how well it works. You'd be surprised.
So did anybody ever say, yes, we messed up, it was our fault?
The Army Corps of Engineers, it's
an organization. But
it's an organization, and it's military.
And it's military. There must have been a human being there somewhere who said...
Well, I can say this. Not a single individual at the Corps of Engineers lost so much as a parking spot.
Yes. Okay. So nobody was punished for this.
Nobody was punished. Nobody went to prison. No one lost so much as a parking spot. But with regard to your question, did the Army Corps ever say, yep, we're at fault, it was our fault? It turned up that because it's a military organization, for them to admit that they'd made a mistake is the same thing as what they call bayoneting the wounded.
Oh,
And it is the same thing as saying something wrong or bad about a former military commander. They don't do that.
okay.
They
All
don't do
right.
that. However, they were found responsible in federal court. The Army Corps of Engineers was found responsible for the failure of the levees, which is specifically explaining which levees failed and why they were responsible. However, financial remuneration was not
I find that
given.
no payment.
No payments were given because the Army Corps of Engineers is protected from financial obligations should their levees fail due to the Flood Protection Act of 1928.
Okay, so, but do you feel like you won?
Yes, the several reasons that my organization has won. One of the reasons is actually quite recent. The Associated Press, which is a worldwide organization with offices all over the world, has put out what they call a style guide. And in that style guide, it tells its reporters that whenever they discuss the flooding of New Orleans, they are obligated to say it was because of the failure of the levees, not the storm.
Oh,
and
good.
Depending on the story, depending on how much detail is allowed, depending on the context, they can even supposed to further add that those levees were built by the Army Corps of Engineers.
Wow. So whenever someone talks about it, they're allowed, they've got to do your story, which the truth, yes, and tell the story the way you have discovered. Well,
it's interesting
Sandy,
you call it my story, but what you mean is that my story, which is the truth. Yeah.
Yes, I do believe it is the truth. I have not independently verified it. So I was figuring out how best to say that. Sandy, can you talk a little bit about how it feels now that you have stepped up into this leadership position? This is a podcast about leadership and stepping forward.
Well, so I'm going to take this moment to calm everybody down, because everyone must feel a little nervous before sticking your neck out, so to speak. Speaking about things that you're not 100% sure, but you're pretty sure, but that go against common knowledge. Well, there's a safety net for you. I wasn't an engineer, but if it turned out that I was wrong, I don't need to worry about my engineering career being destroyed.
Okay.
I wasn't an attorney. If it turned out that I was wrong, I didn't have to worry about losing my law license. So, as a citizen in the United States where I live, if it turned out that I was wrong, all I had to do was say, "Oops, sorry, I guess I was wrong." And for the first months to a year that I began my crusade to get the truth out, I was worried about somebody would jump out from behind a tree with the truth.
Yeah.
That the Army Corps of Engineers and the people that wanted the Army Corps of Engineers to look innocent. I kept thinking they were always saying, "Oh, there's information you don't know. There's information I can't give you because it's confidential." And I'm going, "Well, why not?" That's another tack used by the big guys with a painful truth. They'll try to tell you, "Oh, you're wrong, but I can't tell you why. It's confidential."
Yes. Yeah. Why? How does it feel now that you've been doing this for how many years? It's
17
years. How do you feel about yourself as someone who speaks up and speaks out?
I found in myself an individual that I had no idea was there, and my family didn't know it was there either. I'm still shocked by the like, for example, I hope it's okay to tell our listeners that I found out on a day's notice, or less than a day's notice, that I would be doing this interview today, and not a problem. I just combed my hair and put on a nice dress, and here I am, and feel prepared for whatever you can throw at me. So
would you have been able to do that before the flood, before the hurricane?
I don't think I could have. Well, perhaps I could have, but I didn't have the opportunity, obviously. But but I definitely didn't know that I had it in me. And I initially didn't want to be the spokesperson. When I first had the idea, I needed to get the truth out. I thought to myself, well, I need a famous spokesperson. And so I looked around in Louisiana, who is famous in Louisiana, who might want to be a spokesperson. And that's when I found out a nobody can't just get in touch with a celebrity. It can't be done. So I realized that very quickly. And I said to myself, well, I guess I'm going to have to be the spokesperson until we can find a celebrity. So that's another message for your listeners, that you don't need a celebrity. If you could get one, sure, bring them on. But you don't need a celebrity to lead a crusade in your own neighborhood to make your world a better place.
So let me ask you, I'm so inspired by everything that you're doing. What is your organization? So levees.org. What is your organization doing now?
Right now, we are very focused on making sure that every single engineering student that comes out of engineering schools studies engineering catastrophes and learns why they need to be studied and knows the lessons that can be learned from them. Right now in America, there is no mechanism by which engineering students are going to even learn about this disaster as recently as 17 years ago.
Really?
Some of their professors might talk about it, but it should be required for every single engineering student. And that's one of the things that we're working on.
Wow. I'm surprised. I thought you would, I assumed that as an engineer, you're supposed to learn about failure, but no, not necessarily.
Nope. Not necessarily, at least not in America.
That's scary. Okay, that's very scary. Well, Sandy Rosenthal, thank you so much for being a guest. How can people, actually, I'm going to ask one more question, which is, you now have a podcast, Beating the Big Guys. So if
I also have a book.
And you have a book, yes.
It's called Words Whispered in Water, which came out in 2015, right in the middle of the pandemic, where I go into a whole lot more detail than your listeners heard today.
Right. So there's a wonderful book, and we're posting a link to that also in the show notes. There's a quote that I found by I have to just find it right here, by the author Rebecca Traister, who says, "In the United States, we have never been taught how non-compliant, insistent, furious women have shaped our history and our present, our activism and our art. We should be taught." So I love it that you were a woman who got angry and spoke up. I said, never underestimate the power of an angry woman or someone who's really pissed off.
Anger, so long as it's harnessed properly, is a great motivator.
Exactly. So if someone is listening and wants to either support your organization or learn how they can step up to deal with an injustice, what can you recommend?
I definitely would recommend getting in touch with me through my Instagram account. The Instagram account is Beat the Big Guys. And I would love to talk with anybody who is looking for advice on ways to make the world a better place.
Great. And you listen to her podcast as well. And let this be an example to us all that if you're angry, do something about it. Speak up, raise your voice, and channel that anger. Yes. Thank you very much, Sandy, for joining us. I will put links in the show notes of how to reach you and your organization. So thank you for being a guest on Speakers Who Get Results.
You are so very welcome.
Thank you. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Tell your friends, subscribe to us. Oh, and especially, please leave us a positive review and a good rating on Apple Podcasts. That's the one that matters. Thank you all. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.